Here we go.
Okay, so my project is dealing with automating a form of arbitrage called ADR/ORD.
We're still getting the feedback here.
I think it's because these speakers are on.
Right, well, right. About that, everyone.
All right. So yeah, my project is automating a form of arbitrage dealing with Adr and Ord stock pairs and performing all of the technical analysis that needs to be done automatically. So we'll begin by giving a brief introduction and going over the project overview. So arbitrage is a risk-free trading strategy that uses a large volume of rapid trades to profit off of price discrepancies between similar or equivalent stock groups or pairs. The classic example is represented in this right graph. This is the price discrepancies between the S&P 500 index and the actual sum of the 500 companies that are a part of it. So this is actually on the day that the discrepancy was the largest in the past 10 years. It rarely ever gets to 40 cents of a deviation, but it's just a good illustration of what this is using, or what the kind of price discrepancies you would see to profit off of arbitrage. So in the example, whether say the S&P index is cheaper than the actual bundle of the 500 shares, you would be buying the S&P 500 index and selling the actual bundle of shares and expecting those prices to converge, and you would make a profit off of the price discrepancy. So I'm dealing with a form of arbitrage called Adr and Ord pairings arbitrage. ADRs are American depository receipts that represent foreign stock in a foreign stock exchange. So the example that I've been running with throughout my project is BlackBerry. BlackBerry is a Canadian company, so it trades originally on the Toronto Stock Exchange, listed on the New York Stock Exchange, so American traders can easily access shares of BlackBerry. So when you're trading in arbitrage, you have to do quite a bit of technical analysis to determine whether or not price discrepancies are, one, severe enough for you to profit, and two, whether or not your trading constraints are going to limit you and expose you to risk. Ideally, it's a risk-free trading strategy, but that is only if you can trade instantaneously, which nobody can. So there's a solid amount of risk analysis that needs to go into, that you need to see and produce before you can actually trade this safely. So that's what my project is automating. So going through the project requirements one last time, these are the original objectives that I set out to accomplish and how I achieved them. First, I wanted my program to be very generalized and work for any Adr or Ord pairs that have overlapping market hours. That's necessary because if you know the pairs have no overlapping market hours, then you can't. Actually, over how this arbitrage works first. So Adr and Ord pairs, you can perform arbitrage by doing a swap, which is going through a depository institution. If the ADR is very cheap and the Ord is very expensive, I can buy the ADR. I can enlist a depository institution to convert that ADR into an ORD and sell it for me on the foreign market. And that obviously incurs a cost and a commission that goes to the depository institution. So there's this instantaneous or near instantaneous swap that goes on to perform this type of arbitrage. So you need overlapping market hours so that you can trade either side simultaneously. And this was pretty easy to meet this requirement. I just had to generalize the API queries that I ran in my program. which was not too hard. The second major objective was look into persistence of moments and magnitude analysis. So that's like when a price discrepancy occurs, how long does it persist for? How severe is that price discrepancy over that period? And this type of table and graph, after going over some theory, gives you a look into the type of risk that you'll be incurring and whether or not it'll be safe for the investor to trade long term. And I successfully met this requirement. I produced persistence intervals of separations, and I constructed and compared them to user constraints, which we'll see in the project demo in a couple slides. The third major objective was to give a dollar amount profit for a day of trading for a given strategy and rate. And so that given strategy is ADR ORD swaps. And the depository rate is going to be set by the user based on the cheapest depository fee that they have access to. This dollar amount estimate is an overestimate and should be considered as an upper bound of what can be made, because there are some convolutions with the data I had access to. But I successfully met this also by assuming the user is a price taker, which is pretty safe to assume for any retail investor. And this approach allows for minute-by-minute profit calculation and thus a daily profit estimate. So the software system architecture, just to go over this one last time, I used the Bloomberg REST/Rapid API and AlphaVantage API to pool my data. So you see those databases at the top, and they feed into the AV API and the Bloomberg API. Through user input, I generalized the API requests and the queries to then digest the JSON dumps that come from them into a pandas data frame. That data frame with all of the statistical analysis then is used to produce some graphical analysis of discrepancies, persistence intervals, magnitudes, profit curves, which is then displayed to the user. So you see that feeding into the separation and profit analysis, and then down to graphical input. So now going into the results of this project. I successfully produced graphical numerical price separation and risk analysis. This is a flexible program, and it produces daily profit estimates. And so going over these three major graphs on the right-hand side, these are kind of the three big ones to focus on. The top one is the absolute value of the price separation between the two pairs, or between the pairs. And that's measured by that blue line. And then the red line is the depository fee that the user has access to. So we see in this graph that the user has an access to a 10-cent depository fee, or $0.1. And throughout the day of trading, we see this one pretty massive spike above the depository rate. So that means that for at least some period of time, the user had severe enough pricing the commission to the depository institution. The second graph is going a little bit into the risk analysis, and it'll be more thoroughly explained when we go over the project demonstration, but the general idea is this. Each of these points on the blue line represents the average value of the magnitude of separation through for a moment of price separation. So say on that moment 0, so the first price separation of the day, say it lasted for 3 minutes. Over those 3 minutes, the average separation was, it looks to be a little less than 5 cents, so about 4 cents. And then on moment 1, so the second price separation of the day, suppose it lasted for 2 minutes. It was about an 18-cent separation. So the reason this graph is important is ideally you would want to see the blue line bounce pretty closely around the red line. The reason for that is because if you have a graph like this, where most of the 3 of the 4 blue points are below 5 cents, that implies that most of the price separations that are occurring throughout the day are only in like the 2 to 3 to 4 cent range, and that there's this massive 18-cent jump in the middle of the day. That's implying that there was some extremely volatile shock to the stock. So like a block order of maybe some major institution sold off or bought a bunch of shares and moved the price slightly. But that happens very infrequently in the market. So if you see one massive spike, 1 or 2 massive spikes, and the rest of the points are very low, that means that the user probably can't use this trading strategy long term. And the profit for the day graph, again, this will be reviewed in more detail in the next slide, but it's just a graph of the actual moment-wise profit throughout the day. That's represented in the blue line. And then the orange line is the cumulative summation of that moment-wise profit. So you see it spike up as accordingly with the blue spikes, but it then steadies off if there's no spikes after that. So it gives you an idea of where most of your money from the day is coming from. And again, whether or not it's coming from a bunch of little shocks or one major volatile shock. So now we'll go into the demonstration. Or wait, I might not be able to full screen this. Oh, there we are. Okay, so when the user opens up the program, they see this little title blurb that gives them a little bit of background on what this program is doing. It then goes into a user input markdown cell that goes into pretty extended detail about what each of the data points that we're going to ask from the user mean and how to find them. So this way, if the user is confused about what any of these terms mean, they have an easy way to access them. So we're going to run the cell on our first couple cells. This cell is then running our widgets for the user to actually input their information. Again, we're working with BlackBerry, which is a Canadian company. So the currency pairing sticker is the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar. There's some preset values. So we're assuming that the user has access to a 5 cent depository fee. The transaction speed is measured in trades per minute. So that means they can trade every 30 seconds. The bundle size is the number of shares that they can trade at any one time, because a lot of the time depository institutions will allow for bulk orders to run more smoothly. And the component ratio has to do with how many shares of the ORD is represented in the ADR. So with these things filled out, we're going to move on to assigning those to actual variables within the program. Then another blurb telling the user about what data wrangling is going on. And then we're going to run the API queries and eventually produce this table right here. So this table contains most of our statistical analysis that we need. We just need to convert it into graphical analysis and visualize it, but it has the, as you can see, the adjusted ORD price. So that's the ORD price in US dollars. The nominal price differential or difference, the absolute price difference corrected by the depository fee. And then the capturable separation, which is all non-zero values of the price difference adjusted for the depository fee. And then the minute-wise profit we calculate by taking the transactions per minute of the user, so the trading speed that they have access to, times the bundle order or the bundle size. So this user can trade twice per minute, and they can trade 100 shares at a time. So that's 200 times the capturable separation. So there's 9 cents times 200. That's about $18 for that minute. And we see that in the minute-wise profit. And then the total profit is the cumulative sum of that minute-wise profit column. So then we're going to move down into some of the visual analysis. All right, so this first group of graphs is showing the top one is showing the nominal price difference, and the depository rate bands are in red again. The second one is showing the absolute price difference, again the depository rate in red. So we see there are quite a couple spikes right here in the very beginning of the day at the open of the market that exceed the depository rate, which is then visualized in the following graph, which is the separation exceeding the depository rate. So this is our capturable separation column. This are in the table above, and this is really what's kind of guiding us to where we're making our money. So we see that there must have been some sort of market open event that produced a lot of discrepancies, and that's where we're capturing most of our money. So persistence of separation. This is our risk analysis section. Again, there's a blurb to the user about what's going on. But the two graphs that we're going to produce here are sort of a visualization of the longevity of this trading strategy. I mentioned a little bit about one of them initially, but the other, so we have at the top, this is the one that was displayed in the slides. We see this pretty large spike in the beginning of the day, but it does seem like it somewhat groups around the red band, which is the average of the price separation throughout the day. So maybe this is indicative of, well, the shocks are not, or there was no like major single shock that drove all of our profit for the day. So maybe there are these consistent little shocks that we can consistently capture. The second graph is doing the same thing. It's measuring the moments of persistence. So moment 0 is the first, well, we saw at the very first minute of the market opening at 9:30. There was some price discrepancy. So that's this moment 0. And we see here minutes on the y-axis. So we see that moment of price separation lasted for 4 minutes before closing. So each of these blue points, each of the points on the blue line are representing how long each price separation persisted. And this red line down at the bottom is the user transaction speed. So our user can trade twice per minute. So they can trade half a minute. 0.5 is our red line. The reason this is important is because this is where accidental exposure arises. So if we were to see this blue line dip below our red line at any point, with more specific data, we would likely see this. Since our data is only on the minute time scale, we are likely biased to be above it. But if this blue line dips below our red line at any point throughout the day, that means that if we see that price discrepancy, we might try to start trading on it. Say we see a price discrepancy and the ADR is trading much cheaper than the ORD. So we spring into action and we buy the ADR. But that moment, or that price discrepancy may have persisted for only 20 seconds. So 20 seconds into our opening purchase of the ADR, say the price discrepancy closes. Well, now we have this exposure to a stock that we don't intend to have. Maybe we already converted it into the ORD, but it didn't get sold fast enough. So we've already incurred a commission through the depository institution. And essentially we're risking losing money and not guaranteeing our profit. So this graph is especially important, and with better data would be easier to visualize. But essentially, we would never want to see this blue line dipping below our red line, because that means that we really don't have access to the resources to trade consistently, and yeah, we risk losing a lot of money. So now in the next section, profit potential. Another little section telling what the user, what's going on. But the gist here is that, well, first, the sum of the minute-wise profit column, which is displayed in our total profit column, is $99. So we made about $100 throughout the day if we were trading using this data, assuming our data was good enough. And again, this is an upper bound, so we could expect to make maybe $100 if we traded perfectly for the day based on this data. This next graph is again the moment profit versus the total profit. So the total profit climbs throughout the day and tops out about $100. So this is another cue for our longevity of our trading strategy. The ideal scenario when you're investigating arbitrage is to find some systemic price discrepancy that doesn't disappear, that the market overlooks, and that you were the first to find. If this happens, you would expect for some consistent discrepancy above and beyond your depository rate. So you'd expect this blue line to, instead of just be spiking and then settling at zero, to maybe be consistent at like $1 or $2. And that means that every minute you're making a small amount of money. And then your total profit line would be visualized as close to a perfect 45-degree line without as many kinks as we see here. So obviously we don't see that because BlackBerry is a pretty popular stock. It would be probably a sign that I did something wrong if we did see some systemic price inefficiency. And when we do see prices like this or graphs like this, where the total profit spikes very heavily at like the market open or at any point throughout the day really, and then settles, it's again likely that there's very infrequent market events that drive this price discrepancy and thus our profit. So that's it for the demonstration. I'll go back to presenting. Some project reflections. I definitely didn't have a good idea of, well, I now have a better idea of how to approach more hierarchical program organization. So like the data ingest from the public APIs was by far the most important step in automating this, and the data wrangling and ease of access was very major. So I was very tempted at the very beginning of this project to just kind of produce some example test set of data and work through all of my profit analysis and risk analysis with that, and then leave basically the hard part until later. But that almost guaranteed my failure. So I think it's a good. I learned a lot about how, or I guess where to place your priorities in a project like this. And one mistake I made is I spent a lot of time searching for the perfect data. So again, this program uses minute-by-minute data, but in real arbitrage that you would see at like these institutional firms that are trading hundreds of millions of dollars every second, they obviously have access to data that is on the microsecond time scale. So I was just eager at least to get the second time scale. But obviously this data doesn't come for free. And so finding a free data set like was extremely, I mean, it was impossible. So I lost a lot of time aiming for that when I should have focused on moving the project forward. And I do think this can be considered a success. I, again, wish I had better data, but I think it can be an exemplification of what kind of technical analysis that the actual robust arbitrage programs at like major financial firms work through, but obviously with more accurate results. The racial and gender equity consideration. I've touched on this in my previous presentations, but arbitrage tactics, I really believe, are a great example of how oppressive the financial service industry is based on class. It's a tactic that takes an enormous amount of wealth to start with to make money off of, because I mean, as we saw in this program, the optimistic view is only making about $100 a day. But if you're an institution that instead of trading a bundle size of 100 shares, you're trading a bundle size of 10,000 shares, you actually make some money. And also the collection of good data is the most necessary part for actually being able to use those risk analysis sections and trust your results, or trust the results of the program. So microsecond data is ideal, and second data is the minimum necessary that you would need to actually trade on anything. But access to this information, even through Bloomberg, the Bloomberg subscription API, which was the cheapest one that I found, is about $2,000 a month, which is an enormous paywall for a retail investment. Like you just really can't expect to get access to that data. And then institutional investors are already primarily cishet white men, and diversity is even worse if you're looking at the C-suite or higher up roles in the industry. So this is essentially a strategy for the rich and for the people that aren't bothered by systems of oppression and actually benefit from it highly. And this project doesn't really address these systemic issues at all. I think it can serve as an example of the limitations forced upon the people that are trying to enter this industry without sort of selling out and joining the major financial firms, because obviously this type of program is more of a proof of concept, and you can't really make any trades on that without incurring an enormous amount of exposure and paying a lot of money. So yeah.
Very good. So, so it sounds like I had a question, but then I think you answered it. So it is possible in doing this that you could lose money.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And so, which is always possible in the stock market. I guess the game is losing less than you gain over time, right? Yeah.
Well, the ideal situation in arbitrage is that you have access to perfect information, perfect data, and your transaction speed exceeds the time, essentially the lag that arbitrage takes place. Mm-hmm. But again, you can't really see the exact amount of lag unless you have the perfect data, which you have to pay a lot of money for. So it can be risk-free, but.
Also, it's perfect. If you pay enough, you'll always win.
Yeah, pretty much.
Interesting, but you have to pay a lot of money, so you have to make a lot to compensate for that.
Yeah.
And of course, you did it with one stock, right?
Yeah. So I looked at some other pairings. I looked at Suncor Energy was another big one that I looked at, but I felt like BlackBerry was the only one. Again, these price separations that exceed the depository rates that you can expect in the industry are very, very rare. So like I'm kind of picking the best of the best of the data that I have to sort of illustrate what the program would look like if there were consistent price discrepancies. So Yeah, I kind of had to be nitpicky with the stock pairs I chose just to demonstrate the program's effectiveness. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any separation or any capturable separation throughout the day.
Right, so the bottom line is do you think somebody could actually successfully use this to make money with the level of access that is free? Is that possible?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. I think that like if this program had access to microsecond timescale data, then yes, but that's just impossible to get for free.
And how much is that?
Bloomberg gives you second by second data for $2,000 a month.
Okay.
So the microsecond timescale is probably an insane amount.
Right.
Yeah.
Assuming you could get access to that microsecond, could your program be applied to as is, or would you have to like change it so it works?
No, it could be applied as is. All the queries actually, well, I would have to change the AlphaVantage queries and just move to Bloomberg for all of the data. But yeah, the Bloomberg queries that are written in here are the exact same that you use for the actual paid subscription service. So yeah, it would just be paying and then running the program, and you'd be good to go.
Does anybody out and online have any questions?
Should we turn on the speakers to hear them?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I'm going to turn on the speakers, so I realize probably not hearing you. Okay, okay. Is anybody out there? There. Is everybody alive? Can somebody say something so I just make sure we're still on? Not getting through. Hello?
Hello?
Is that somebody?
Yeah, I can hear you guys.
Okay. So does anybody have any questions or comments on this interesting project? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Cole. I mean, I think that was a fascinating project you did, and seems like you learned a lot. And achieved most of your goals. Yeah. All right. So let me for here, not right on the limelight here. So Thomas is going to talk about his project next. Are you ready to go?
Yeah, let me just share my screen. All right. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about building a blockchain system simulation using code-based cryptography. So I'll first just talk a little bit about, review a little bit about what blockchain is, and then I'll talk about like the overall object-oriented design, go quickly through that, and then I'll talk more about some of what I've been working on with the actual code-based cryptography aspects of the project. So let's get into it. So let me just do this. Okay. So what is a blockchain again? So blockchain is just a distributed ledger where it's a peer-to-peer network. So every person on the network stores a copy of the blockchain. Anybody's able to access it and basically just send out transactions into the network. People mine, designated mining nodes that have to find the nonce value, like I spoke about earlier, in order to append a block to the blockchain. Blockchain is secure due to certain cryptographic techniques like hash functions and digital signatures. And the blockchain constantly checks itself to see that it's valid by calculating hashes and things like that. So it's built in such a way that it's better to join the network than it is to try to attack it because of the computational power you need to attack it. And yeah, blockchain has a lot of other use cases. Obviously, the one that everybody knows is for cryptocurrency, but there are a lot of other different applications for different ways of data storage. This is just a simple, just high level picture of what a blockchain looks like. Blocks are linked in you can think of it like a vector of ever growing length, where each new block references the previous block. Basically, it references the hash of the previous one. And then there's a bunch of data in each block, including the timestamp, the index, the public key, things like that. And that's all goes into the hash function. So yeah, obviously this lends itself really easily to object-oriented design. So I'll just go over a bit some of the classes that I have implemented. Or actually, no, I'll talk about this first. Yeah, so the main goal was to build a simple and realistic blockchain simulation. However, the only difference for mine is that I'm using code-based cryptography. Most other blockchains, most real applications use different code-based crypto systems, or different crypto systems, sorry. So that's the main point of interest in this project. These are particularly interesting because they are resistant to attacks from quantum computing. So other ones are not, and that's why going forward, it's important to consider code-based cryptography and other crypto systems like this. The main focus for the blockchain itself is just the object-oriented programming, like I was mentioning. So some of the key objects are the block, blockchain, and transaction. And I'll go over a bit what some of the key methods are in these. And then these things I worked on in the first few weeks to month of the semester. I talked a little bit about them all in the past presentation. And basically, I just focused on making it as simple as possible, following along with other foundational papers, like the original Ethereum and Bitcoin papers. I also found some other online simulations that people have made on GitHub and sort of check mine against theirs, like try to think about like what the most important features are and how I could just make it so that pretty much anybody can understand what's going on, and there's not much of a barrier to entry. This is just an overview of some of the classes, just a screenshot of the GitHub project that I have. So just going from top to bottom, like I was saying, there's the blockchain classes. I have an encryption class, which this is one of the digital signature algorithms I implemented. And that one uses the private key and public key classes. There's the SHA-256, which that's just the hashing algorithm that I've used. And then there's also the transaction and also the Cern, which is a second digital signature algorithm that I used. And then there's this other folder here, which stores a third digital signature algorithm that I've implemented. And there's a bunch of classes in here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And I meant to include these in some pictures of these classes too. But I'll just go over a bit the blockchain, and transaction classes and talk about some of the key functions. So these ones, first few up here, just accessors, mutators, constructors. So that's not that interesting. But like the last few functions here are obviously calculate hash. We need to hash all the information, all this stuff down here into the block, and that's how the blocks are connected. We need to have a method to mine blocks. So whenever you want to add a block to the transaction, you have to go through the mining process that I've talked about before of finding the nonce value based on the block difficulty. And then we also have a method to verify transactions. This just basically just verifies that all the digital signatures on all of the transactions stored in the block are correct. And I'll talk more about the digital signature algorithms in a bit. We have the blockchain class here. The most important ones here are just, so we have mine pending transactions, which if you give it a reward address of one of the nodes in the blockchain, it'll go through the vector of all the pending transactions, which we store as a private member here. And once you've mined the transactions, it'll give you the reward to this reward address. We have the add transaction, which in order to do this, we need to make sure that a transaction is valid. And again, I'll talk more about what that means for a transaction to be valid in a bit. And lastly, one of the more important ones too is getting the balance of the address. If you just give it the address of a node in the blockchain, it's able to go through all of the transactions that have been generated in the blockchain and tell you what the balance is. And lastly, this is the transaction class. So again, these are all just accessors and mutator functions, but then the ones down here are calculating the hash, which this is actually what you're signing when you perform the digital signatures. And then we have a few different, this one's one of the particular digital signature algorithms, the KKS one that I'll talk about in a second. And then these ones are for one of the other algorithms. Basically, the way I have the test program set up is that the user is able to choose what digital signatures they actually want to use. And so I've implemented these two. I still have to implement the last one, but that shouldn't take too long. Yeah. And I'll talk more about each of those in just a second. So I talked a little bit about digital signature algorithms last time, but just to go over them again. In the blockchain system, transactions need to be secured using public key cryptography. So the idea is basically that if somebody wants to spend their tokens, send them to somebody else in the network, in order to make sure that it's not somebody else just arbitrarily spending your money, you need to sign it with your own private key. And we use digital signatures to accomplish this. Each node, you could think of them as just the users of the blockchain, has a unique public key and private key. The public key allows them to access their wallet, to spend their tokens and to remove them from the blockchain if they want to cash out, basically. And then when they spend the tokens, they have to sign their transaction information with their private key. So what we basically do when we're doing a digital signature is that we take all the data in the transaction that they're trying to add to the blockchain, and we hash it, and then we encrypt it using their private key, and then we attach it to the data finally. And then anybody else on the blockchain, or basically before it's added to the blockchain as one of the pending transactions, it has to be verified using the public key. And you check to see that the resulting hash is equal to what's actually stored in the transaction class itself. So over time, the focus on my project really became more on the digital signature algorithms in particular. I made the basic blockchain object-oriented design pretty quickly. And so I decided mainly to focus on these instead, mainly because I just think they're interesting, and also because I think it's a pretty important area of research. Like I was saying, most blockchains use elliptic curve cryptography, which is insecure versus quantum computing. There are a few existing implementations of code-based cryptography algorithms. A lot of people don't really believe that they're practical due to large key sizes, high memory time usage, things like that. And in particular, one algorithm that I worked with is very new. And so I wasn't able to actually find anything about an implementation of it. The other two, the KKS and Cern one, there is some information about it, but it's still hard to really get much because most people really talk about them purely from a theoretical lens. So yeah, this was the main focus of pretty much the past, say month and a half, 2 months, and still was working on it even, just recently. So each of these digital signature algorithms is pretty much based on the syndrome decoding problem, which is a problem in coding theory when if you have a code, linear code C with a given generator matrix G and a check matrix H, it basically just uses the property that if you multiply any code word by the check matrix H, you will always get 0. So if you receive any code word with an error, you can use the linearity of it to, when you multiply H times Z, it'll be equal to H times X plus H times E, E being the error pattern. And then this, like I said earlier, is 0. So this is just equal to H times E. And the syndrome decoding problem is that given this here, H times E, you have this smaller lookup table basically that uniquely maps this to E. And then that in turn corrects Z to X, sorry. So the syndrome decoding problem is basically given this, you want to find this. And this is what each of these algorithms rely on the most fundamental level. Some of them are a little bit more complicated, but this is the main idea behind a lot of code-based crypto systems. This is the first one I implemented. It's one of the older ones. And I think I talked a little bit about this one last time too, but I'll just briefly go over it again. Unlike other code-based digital signature algorithms, this one relies on arbitrary linear codes. And it relies on the fact that the set of correctable syndromes has a very large linear subspace. And this is a 2-pass signature algorithm. Most actually just do 1. So this one, given that it's pretty old, there's been a lot of different attacks on it. So, and that'll be the same for another one that I talk about in a minute. But this one really, you need to be careful about what parameters you choose. So I had to spend a lot of time working on that and just making sure that what I'm actually doing is secure. So yeah, I had to do a lot of research, read a lot of different papers, that kind of thing. So yeah, here's the implementation of it. The public members, or sorry, the private members are just the parameters that we give. So pretty much from top to bottom, you have the field size, the larger length and dimension, N and K, the smaller length and dimension, little n and little k, and then T1 and T2 are used at the second step of the verification here to check the weight of one of the resulting vectors that we get. And then we also just store the message, and the permutation here has also private members. And the 3 main tasks of digital signatures being, first one, generating public and private keys, second one, signing the message, and third one, verifying the signature. I've split them up to all different functions here, where the basic information flow is that I have one program for each of these processes to create a Magma file. And then I have a second program that will run the Magma file by just writing to the system. And then the third one will be to, given this output that you get from the Magma file, you have to parse all that information and then you bring it back into C++ and then move on to the next step. So this one and the Cern one, because there were a lot of coding theory functions that I wanted to use, I had to work a lot on interfacing between Magma and C++. And that took up a lot of time, and it just required some sort of interesting solutions, I guess. Theoretically, these things, you could implement them in C++ as well, but I sort of felt like it would just be really challenging to implement a lot of the functions. So this was, I felt, the easiest solution given what I have. And yeah. So this is the basic information flow. This is pretty much the same basic information flow for all the digital signature algorithms, but I'll talk a little bit about it in the context of this one. So at the beginning, the parameters are given to the overall blockchain system. Everybody uses the same parameters for each of the nodes. Then the first step, once you have these parameters, is that each of the users generates their own public and private keys, and then I store them within vectors in C++. So here, like I was just saying, we're going to create a Magma file to do this task, to create the public and private keys, run it by writing to the system, and then parse it. And this is all accomplished in 3 C++ functions. So then the transactions added to the blockchain. The way I modeled it now is just that it's a random process. So the transaction is being sent from a random person in the blockchain to another random person, and the amount is random. Then the user who is sending the money has to sign it with their private key. And then this is, again, this is where you're doing these 3 C++ functions where one does the signature, one runs the file, and then one parses it. And then finally, to check if the blockchain is valid, we need to verify all the signatures of the transactions. And then you do the same thing with the 3 functions for that task. This is another digital signature algorithms that I worked on. This is the one that I've worked on most recently for the past roughly 3 or 4 weeks. The paper's actually, I think it was just published earlier this year, so very new research compared to the other 2 that were published, I think both in the 90s. So as such, I pretty much had to build it all from scratch, and there were a lot of different issues that I encountered along the way that made it take a lot longer. And this one relies on a slightly modified version of the syndrome decoding problem called the restricted syndrome decoding problem, which is described a bit here. Basically, it's the same syndrome decoding problem, except for you are only talking about a specific subset of syndromes that have a very specific support size, which support size is just the number of non-zero positions in a vector. So it's also the weight, like I was talking about earlier. So again, this one is pretty similar in terms of ideas. By relying on the syndrome decoding problem, we're basically just generating these random matrices with very specific properties like support size and that kind of stuff up here for the key generation. The signature generations here, we're just sampling a random Y from this very specific uniform distribution that's specified by this parameter gamma that we give it. We hash it using a very specific hashing function that took me a while. This was one of the bigger challenges of the algorithm of implementing it. And there's also the element of rejection sampling that this one has, where we want to make sure that basically this Z, which is this vector here, that's generated based on this random Y, and also this random E from earlier, this matrix. We need to make sure that its entries are over a very specific subset of our finite field given by another parameter. So both of these, the hashing part and the rejection sampling part, made it a lot harder for me to do this, especially because there's not really any existing, at least for the hashing part, there's not really much existing, or any, I guess, existing literature on how to do this. So these both, yeah, they both took me a while, and finally was able to get it pretty recently. So I originally implemented this whole thing in Magma, and then a little while ago, I was just really having trouble with the final verification steps of it because it was pretty much just taking way too long, and it would just not finish, basically because of all the different functions I was using in Magma. So instead, I rewrote the whole thing in C++ here. So this is just an overview of the class. There's a lot of different stuff here. And I also had to implement a lot of matrix operations because pretty much every step of the way in this algorithm, you need to do just simple things like matrix multiplication, addition, things like that. But also some more complicated operations like generating this matrix E here. So I wrote that all in here as well. And similar to the other one, all the private members pretty much are just the parameters. So these few things up here are all the parameters But then I also store the signature and store the public and private keys and all that as private members. The hashing implementation. So I talked a little bit about the hashing. So the hashing, it's very specific because it requires that the final digest size, or like the final length of the string once you hash it, is equal to B, one of the parameters that you have. All of its entries need to be from 0 or plus or minus 1 in the finite fields. And then the final weight of the number of non-zero entries needs to be another one of the parameters that you give it. So the idea that I came up with is basically just to repeatedly hash a message until these requirements are met. So we start by hashing a message with the SHA-256 algorithm together with a counter, starting at 0. I then convert the hash to ternary, which is 0, 1, and 2, and I compute the weight and the length of the resulting hash. And if the weight and the length meet the desired parameters, then we will finally output the hash by sending 0 to 0, 1 to 1, and 2 to -1 in F sub q. But if that doesn't work, it'll just increment the counter and redo the hash. And that should just keep going until you finally get a hash with the desired properties for the algorithm. So the last one I worked on is the Cern Identification scheme. This is also a pretty old one. So you actually have to be pretty careful about using it. You have to do it. I think you have to do it like 40 or 50 times repeatedly in order to actually make it secure. So it's kind of worse for that reason. In contrast to the other ones, this is an identification scheme, which the basic idea of an identification scheme is over an unreliable channel, one entity, they call themselves the prover, seeks to prove themselves to a verifier. And the other ones obviously are digital signature algorithms. So this one needs to be changed a bit around in order to adapt it to perform digital signatures. And likewise, this one also relies on the syndrome decoding problem, like the other two do as well. This is the implementation. Again, everything is, we have the same sort of idea where we have to interface between C++ and Magma. There are a lot of other coding theory functions that I wanted to use for this one, and that made it necessary to do this. And then, yeah, this one was a bit simpler than the other ones, but it still took a little while. So for the results, as expected, or at least as I expected, code-based digital signature algorithms can take a lot of time and use a lot of memory, which just results obviously in the blockchain being slowed down a lot. Even for low block difficulty, processing, say a low number like 5 transactions with their signatures can take 3 to 4 minutes for the second algorithm that I discussed, which is obviously not ideal. But it also depends. It just depends on how much rejection we're doing. But there's a lot of variability. You know, it could be anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes for that number of transactions. So it's obviously not great. Cern identification, like I was just talking about, can take a while since we need to perform a lot of different iterations of the algorithm for security. And the KKS algorithm seems to perform the best, but we still have the problem in that one of having really large key size, especially because in order to make it secure, we need to have really, really large parameters, and the keys that we're storing are really large matrices. So it's obviously not great, but it sort of depends on your, how much memory you can use. I plan to gather for the final video. I want to get some more data, some formal analysis of the memory usage, time usage for all the steps of the process, just so that I can compare and contrast the performance of each. But my final conclusion pretty much is that I don't think for now it's necessary to use code-based digital signature algorithms, but I do still think that it's great to study these because they will probably be useful in the future. And obviously it's important to have a different candidate for when quantum computing is actually a reality. So I'm going to show a little simple demonstration. I I'm running it locally on my computer, so I can't actually do the Cern and the KKS algorithms because I don't have Magma here. So I'll just talk about the other one. This is just a simple like test program. There's not really much going on here. We pretty much just ask the user what they want their block difficulty, block reward to be. We can ask them what digital signature algorithm they want to use. Obviously, like I was just saying, we can only use the second one because it's on my local computer. And we also ask how many transactions we want in the chain. And then we're just gonna create all these, first we're gonna create all the public and private keys for all the nodes in the network. And then we're gonna create all the random transactions here. And then for simplicity right now, only the user has created their own node and they're the ones that are mining. And then we'll get the balance of their node before and after mining. And then we'll also get all the balances of everybody else who's using the chain. So I'll just show you a little sample output here. Okay, so I'll just do a low block difficulty. So let me make this bigger. Let's just do a few transactions, just so it doesn't take too long. So like I was saying earlier, what needs to be signed is the hash of all the information in the transaction. So we generate that here, and then we're going to generate a signature for that message with the public and private keys. And then before adding it to the pool, we need to make sure that it's valid. And then now the user is going to mine. This is your balance before mining, obviously 0, and I set the mining reward to be 500. So after you've mined the block successfully, you receive the reward. And then we're going to check all the other balances of all the nodes. So I just put a few nodes in there. So randomly, this is just what happened. These two people have paid out to this person here who's received their money. Okay. Yeah, so in the next week, I also want to beef up the simulation a bit and be able to collect more data for the final video. So that I just have more to show off, but I've been focusing a lot recently on implementing a digital signature algorithm. So that took a lot more time. So for the reflection, I really learned the importance of having detailed plans for my ideas. It's a very bad idea to just go in blind and sort of, plan as you go along. I learned a lot about object-oriented programming. I have about like 20 different classes to work with, some of whose implementation files can be pretty long. So it was kind of hard to make them all work together, I'd say. And so I just found it was pretty important to like have good documentation to myself and remember, what does what and what I need to do overall. And also just try to keep it as simple as possible, just to not make myself or anybody else using it more confused than they need to be. And I obviously learned a lot about cryptography and code-based digital signature algorithms, of course. I spent a lot of time reading different papers, doing different literature searches, and that was a big time investment in this project. And lastly, for the racial and gender statement, throughout the project, I tried to just make the simulation as accessible as possible. I tried to model it in an equitable way. I'm trying to make it so that pretty much anybody can pick it up and figure out what's going on as long as you're interested in the project. And I don't want anything else to be a barrier to entry other than just interest. And like I mentioned earlier in the previous presentations, blockchain is pretty special because in an ideal implementation, in an ideal world, there's no barriers to entries other than simply internet access, which increasingly more people have nowadays, and being interested in becoming involved. So yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any questions before I ask you? Any comments? So, I don't read that. Can you explain what a restricted vector is?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Can you explain what a restricted vector is?
Oh, restricted vector, sure. Let me go back to that. So sorry, I went off that. Okay, here it is. So the restricted syndrome decoding problem is the same syndrome decoding problem, except for you're only considering syndromes with a specific weight. So one of the parameters that we give to the algorithm is the weight that we want it to have, and then we're only considering those syndromes.
Okay, so it's restricted in the sense that it's a smaller set of possibilities.
Yeah, it's just a subset. Just a subset.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So you're saying only one of the algorithms is capable of being run locally, and that was, of course, the one that's not particularly secure, so you have to run it a lot of times.
Yeah.
To achieve a certain level of security.
Yeah.
I mean, in general, for these, if you have enough, I mean, if somebody has too much computational power, or perhaps a quantum computer, what does that give you? I mean, in terms of you can cheat, or you can create your own currency, or you can steal people's money. What happens?
Are you asking in the digital signatures themselves, or?
Well, I'm asking within currency.
Yeah.
Can somebody who has enough computational power exploit the system, other than, of course, just mining? Or is that not a problem?
I mean, there are a couple different things put in place. I mean, one of them is that if, for example, you were to like change information in the blocks, since the hash depends on all the information in the blocks, that would create a different hash, and then everybody else, all the other nodes would identify that it's like a fraud, basically, and it would all become invalid. So if you're trying to be malicious in that way, no, that wouldn't work. I mean, the idea is that, like, if you say you wanted to like recreate the entire blockchain yourself, right, and then somehow try to fraud people out of their money, the resources you'd have to put into that to do that, to perform all the mining again, should be greater than if you just started mining in the blockchain itself. Should be greater than the reward, basically. So it's just more advantageous to join it yourself.
So, conversely then, are people disadvantaged by not having a lot of computational power?
I mean, yeah, if you want to mine, yeah, definitely. Because it could just take a long time. And especially because nowadays, like, things like Bitcoin, they're scaling up the amount of, they're scaling up like the block difficulty. So if you don't have like up-to-date computers, you'll kind of fall behind. But I mean, yeah, it's only really the mining aspect, yeah, that you would be, it would be harder for you to do that if you don't have good computational resources.
Now, what about of course, one of the criticisms of Bitcoin is that it actually takes more electricity to generate value than the electricity you spend generating. In other words, and so you can look at that two ways: you're wasting money, somebody's money, or it has an environmental impact because you're doing all this work to create value, but that value has a cost on the environment because it's literally, increasing the carbon load.
Yeah.
Have you thought about that at all, or have any comments on that?
I mean, a bit. I haven't thought about it too much. to be honest, just because this is just a simulation and more focused on the digital signatures. I mean, obviously that is an issue. I mean, I guess it just depends on the rate at which new Bitcoin is generated, right? Like it should be, perhaps it should just be rescaled and lowered, because you don't need to be doing that as much for people to just be using it and sending money to it, that kind of stuff. It's only to like create new Bitcoin. Yeah.
Well, one interesting thing that happens, of course, oftentimes is people look for free computational cycles that they can somehow exploit, right? And so I was talking with Professor Eiden and I were talking last week or so with the people who run REPL. The REPL that we use in some of our classes is a programming environment, free programming environment, where you can pay a little bit and get increased performance. Well, apparently they have to monitor all the time. People try to use their systems to compute Bitcoins, right? And in general, this is a problem for any company that provides free computing resources. They have to monitor it, or people basically exploit them for things like this.
Yeah.
So I mean, interesting. I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, there's, this whole realm is interesting because you look, of course, at theoretical aspects largely and programming aspects. This has ecological, sociological, economic aspects, that are, even philosophical aspects that are all tied to the concept of using cryptocurrency. I think it's going to be interesting to see where this takes us, and it's going to be important that people think critically about all these aspects. Anyway, anybody else have any comments? Okay, well, thank you so much for your presentation, and next, let me look at my list. Yes, Caitlin Griffith is going to be next.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay.
You can hear me and everything?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Okay. So hi, everyone. I'll be presenting my final results, and my presentation is again about calcium dysregulation in the mitochondria as a link to autism spectrum disorder. So just a background on kind of why I started this project. I've always done some papers and projects on autism in general with my major, and so I kind of wanted to link that to what my advisor specializes in, and it ended up working pretty well. But autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a developmental condition in many of us and our humans in general that causes a lot of challenges in social interactions, speech, and nonverbal communication, and it causes a lot of repetitive behaviors. But there are a lot of varying again, it's on a spectrum, so there's different severities as well. And there are a lot of comorbid disorders that come along with the disorder as well. This affects 1 in 59 children, and the average age of diagnosis for autism is around 4, and it's very delayed because it's defined on behavioral qualities that are kind of age dependent and aren't really seen until the kid gets a little bit older. So that will kind of play into some of the reflection here, but that's autism. And for my project, I was wanting to think maybe if there's a link in the dysregulation of calcium within the mitochondria, in our astrocytes in our brain, and autism spectrum disorder, and kind of how the signaling and differences in that signaling can cause or lead to autism. So with my advisor, we kind of looked into the brain's calcium regulation within the mitochondria, and calcium is really, really important within our brain, and it regulates a ton of different cell activities. We really need it. And we did a lot of research, or I did, and there's a lot of documented mitochondrial dysfunction in general for kids on the spectrum, but no one really knows exactly if that calcium signaling is what has to do with these dysfunctions. So we'll look at the Ip3 receptor, which is a channel that allows calcium to exit the endoplasmic reticulum and enter the mitochondria. And we looked at that closely because there's supposed to be maybe this deficiency in how it releases calcium. And then we created with Berkeley Madonna a model with some of those correct numbers for autism in order to compare it to a control model. So we ended up, I'll show you later, we have 3 different kind of models to show on Berkeley Madonna. And one was like the original Huart cell that only shows the endoplasmic reticulum. And one was one that I created with the mitochondria. And then another one where we kind of added in that autism factor to kind of dial it based on severity. So again, a little background on astrocytes. There are a cell type within our nervous system that aid in axon guidance and synaptic support. So they're very important, and they maintain and regulate our synapses. They regulate our blood flow in our brain and support the blood-brain barrier. All really crucial things for our lives. There's a lot known about them, but there's a ton that's unknown as well. So the structure and protein expression of astrocytes are altered in different diseases that are well known, like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, epilepsy, schizophrenia, and now they're kind of finding things in depression and anxiety as well. Natural change represents a reaction to an injury, or whether the astrocyte is providing detrimental signals that contribute to a disorder. So there's a lot of research going on with this. It's really hard to kind of actually experimentally look at this because you have to look closely at one variable instead of seeing the whole entire astrocyte itself. So that's where cell modeling comes in and using Berkeley Madonna. So one thing that we'll be modeling, this is what we are modeling, it's called calcium oscillations. And again, calcium is a very important messenger within our nervous system, and that signaling is all life. We need it, everyone needs it. And it regulates basic activities of the cell, but they're important again. And within the astrocytes, the concentration changes within our cytosol in the cell, which is the fluid around all of the little important cell thing, like parts, like the mitochondria, or the endoplasmic reticulum. It's kind of that fluid within the cell membrane. And so the changes in concentration are really important there and are thought to be triggers for certain signaling processes. So after we kind of change the mitochondria in our modeling, we're really looking at the concentration in the cytosol as well. And either an excess of calcium or a deficiency within our astrocytes can lead to a lot of issues. So that is what we looked closely at. And here we have a picture of kind of exactly what I looked at. It's a little bit more complex. I have a very simple cell model drawing that we can look at later. But the red dots are the calcium. They come into the cell just through all these different channels, and they're not super important for what you need to know, but they come in through these different channels and receptors. And this white part all around is all cytosol. So that's where they kind of travel through to get to different storage places, like the endoplasmic reticulum. And once that travels through, we have the Ip3 receptor right here, which is known to puff calcium out into this small little space of cytosol. And once those receptors kind of puff it out, they'll come in through the mitochondria through these different channels. And then the mitochondria kind of does its thing, you know, it's the powerhouse of the cell. So the calcium helps a lot with that. And it'll leave the cell through this exchanger. So kind of all of these parts we looked at really closely to see how exactly we'd model the cell and set up our equations exactly for Berkeley-Madonna to kind of get the mitochondria into our model. So my requirements that I needed all of the Berkeley-Madonna manuals and Huart cell, which I'll talk about later, and numerical integration introduction. All of this that I did was very, very new to me at the beginning. Now I have a much better understanding, which is a good thing, but all of this was a big deal, and I kind of had to use Khan Academy, Google, all that to learn all these new different equations, and Berkeley-Madonna software is simple, but I did have to learn it, of course. So then we needed to use rate laws and equations for our control model, which was used with this Huart cell model, which is a little older, but it's used in a lot of different research studies for modeling cells. And then we had to kind of figure out how to change that and add in different equations and laws to manipulate the cell model and add in the mitochondria and how autism might change that as well. And I needed Cheryl Hemkin, who is my advisor. She has a lot of experience with this, and she's really great. I met with her like twice a week all semester to kind of go over everything, and she was very helpful. So some of the architecture in Berkeley-Madonna, again, it's very simple to use, and it was pretty fun to use too. But I use Berkeley-Madonna 10, and this is written in Java and C kind of. It's a mathematical platform that's really quick, and it solves those systems of ordinary differential equations, or ODEs. So I had different inputs, like how we want to be integrated, which I use Rosenbrock's method, how long I wanted this to be going, so when to start it, when to stop it, and how many step sizes I wanted to take within these equations. Then I needed every single part of the cell needed a differential equation. So I had one for the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Ip3 receptors, and the cytosol. Then I needed initial concentrations of how much calcium was in each of those places in order to perform those equations, and some rate constants, because there are laws within the cell of how fast or how much the calcium can go. And so there's different constants within those rates. And then eventually this outputted a plot of those calcium signaling oscillations, and it showed me each kind of part of the cell. I can zoom into different places, everything like that. And I did this in 3 different models. So as an outcome, we did find a change, which was great. And it corresponds to literature that we read, and I read all this different stuff, which was great. And so what happened and what we found is that the calcium concentration did decline in the mitochondria as we tweaked that Ip3 receptor. In comparison to our literature, what we found with one big study was that maybe they found that calcium exiting the Ip3 receptors from the endoplasmic reticulum would not change in amplitude, but have a 10% decrease in its frequency for those oscillations. And so frequency did seem to change, and as well as concentration, of course, because those receptors weren't really open for as long as they are with a normal cell model. So not as much calcium could come out. Okay, so yeah, biting in that mitochondria equation that I kind of came up with to make calcium come in through the mitochondria through that MCU channel and then out through the exchanger that I showed you before. It kind of added this new calcium pathway into the cell. And so then with that model and that equation, in order to tune the cell towards a cell with autism, we added in a variable called ASD, and it ended up just being 1/10 because they saw that 10-fold decrease in calcium with the frequency of calcium coming out of the endoplasmic reticulum. So we added this in, and it was very helpful because we could kind of tune it and make it like 7/10 or something like that to make it, I can show you later, but to make it more of a spectrum. So someone who is highly autistic to someone who is higher functioning. So that kind of allowed us to tune it differently and see what kind of changes we see. So yeah, that is below 1. And 1 was normal, a normal cell model. So here's a very basic drawing of the cell where we have just the whole cell, and the cytosol is just the gray over here. This is the mitochondria, and this is the endoplasmic reticulum. This is where the calcium is going to come out of those receptors that I talked about. And those receptors are what we're changing, but we're looking for changes kind of in this area, which affects how much calcium could get into the mitochondria. So in general, we're just kind of looking in this area especially. So that's kind of, so the Huart cell 2 won't have this mitochondria equation added in. So it's just looking at this part and this part. This is what we added in. So I decided to use Hill equations to do this, which are used a lot in different pharmacology and biochemistry studies and like producing medicine, stuff like that, which are 2 closely related equations that reflect the binding of ligands to macromolecules as a function of the ligand concentration. So it kind of, they're looking closely for different biochemical processes in the cell to see binding and stuff like that. We use this because there's a maximum amount of calcium that can enter and leave the mitochondria or the cell in general, but looking closely at the mitochondria, there's a very top amount of calcium that can enter, and like it's kind of like the doors on a bus. You can only have 10 people at a time coming out, not 1,000. So that is kind of why we decided to use that type of equation. And then here we can see V6 is calcium like leaving the cell or leaving the mitochondria. We have this maximum rate of calcium that can leave through that calcium exchanger, and then it's going into the cytosol, which is Z. Then we have a rate constant here that kind of corresponds to that exchanger again, and Z again, which is going into the cytosol. And same for here, this is going into the mitochondria, so we created an M variable, and it has a maximum amount that can enter the mitochondria, and this is how it is divided to kind of show how much is entering the mitochondria in a specific time so it can oscillate. So then we added in this differential equation for the mitochondria, which was V6 minus V7. And you can see it here. So this right here is kind of, this is just the mitochondria and how much is leaving the mitochondria or entering the mitochondria. How much calcium. So this one is a normal cell line where that tuner for autism was a 1. So you can see that there are oscillations. This is very zoomed into a little part, but there are oscillations within this of mitochondria entering the cell and then it was leaving, so there's not as much, that kind of stuff. This red line, you can kind of see a difference. The red line is where the tuner is at 0.55. So it's very flat, just like the other green one. I don't know why it's green, but this one, this other green one is the 1/10 variable that we added in at first. They're both very just straight lines. So there's not a lot of oscillations at all. You can see very, very tiny ones, but there's like a little more of a concentration with the 0.55 one. So that's why we kind of decided to look at it with a higher variable input for the autism variable. And you can see here, it's a little easier to see. There's more oscillations in all of these, but we went up to 0.8. So there's 0.8 as the orange ones, 0.9 for the purple, and 1, the normal cell for the green. And so you can see here that the least amount of calcium entering the mitochondria is when that tuner is dialed down to 0.8. And the most amount is when it's a normal cell and it has the best oscillations as well. And this is right in between. So one thing that's very important, like I talked about before as well, is how much calcium is entering and exiting the cytosol. And so this is the same equation that I just showed you that was run out, but I just zoomed into the cytosol oscillations, and it's very zoomed in again, but you can see the black lines are oscillations within that normal cell. The red lines are within the 0.9 variable, autism variable, and then the blue ones are with that 0.8 autism variable. And so you can see the frequency is very different and all the concentration. They're all a little different, but the red and black are a little more similar. But if I were very well versed in this, it's kind of, there's a lot more to read into it with how there's some repetitions within this. There's like different periods as well. So, but you can really see how that frequency and concentration changes within the cytosol too. So here I'll show you my Berkeley Madonna, and I'll show you those 3 different cells and kind of how they look as a whole on Berkeley Madonna. So this is the Huart cell. So this is the cell just without the mitochondria variable that I made added in. So if you can kind of, I'll zoom in for you, you can see that there's different oscillations, and the black is the cytosol, the red represents the endoplasmic reticulum calcium, and the blue is the Ip3 receptor concentration. So those are the 3 different variables that I looked at here, and you can just see kind of how it's supposed to look. Those oscillations are kind of supposed to look like this or close to this. And over here, I've shown you guys this before, so I won't show it again, but this is kind of what is entered in, the start time, stop time, the step sizes, and all of the differential equations for cytosol, endoplasmic reticulum, and Ip3 receptors, and then those kind of initial concentrations and the equations for each of those. Right here is the, oops, it's a lot hard to see. This is my graph with the mitochondria added in. And so it kind of looks like what I showed you before, where the red is still the ER and the black is the cytosol and green is the mitochondria here. So you have to zoom in closer to the green to kind of see the oscillations, but it's still, it looks good. This is like a good thing that we found. Definitely a change in the mitochondria and a change in some of the cytosol components as well. So this is just the mitochondria without the ASD added in. And then this is with ASD added in. And it's very, very, very different, as you can see. This one's with 0.7 added in. And so you can see it's very wonky at the beginning, some oscillations, but I'll show you, oops, the 8 out of 10. 2. Yeah, these are some better oscillations, and that's all added in. So this is the final kind of product with that ASD tuner. And it shows, you can see the tuner is right here, added as a variable, and you can kind of change what it produces with that. So, okay. So in reflection, I really learned a ton. I had no idea what I was doing coming in, honestly, and I learned a ton. Berkeley Madonna was very fun to learn. That was my happiness reflection, I guess. It was a great project. But in terms of, I guess, what I could do better and some errors that were made, definitely were a lot of assumptions that came into designing the cell, just because there's not a ton of research on this, not a ton of studies that I could use. In dial that I kind of talked about. And with more time, I think that I could definitely fine tune my equations, which we're still kind of working on trying to do that, and make some of less of those assumptions. But maybe in more time, there's more research that I can use as well. But with these results, it is kind of clear that mitochondrial signaling dysfunction is affected in those on the spectrum. And that with these results, I guess it really could be due to that Ip3 receptor latency and opening and closing while calcium leaves the endoplasmic reticulum. And so if this, with further research on all of this as a whole, it would be really cool to kind of see if this is an early life biomarker, meaning we can kind of look in, even when a baby's like in the womb, kind of look in at their Ip3 function and see if there is an issue there, and kind of maybe be able to tell if they are on the spectrum and be able to diagnose it much earlier than 4 years old. And it also could lead us to some treatment options for autism as well, because we don't have many right now, especially medicinal treatment options. So yeah, that could be a big deal if this kind of goes further than it is already. So within my race and gender consideration, again, there's a very large issue in gender differences within autism diagnoses because there's a huge difference in how symptoms present themselves in males and females, and that makes females very underdiagnosed in comparison to males, or they're diagnosed much later in life instead of at that 4-year mark, maybe it's like 10. And so they just have different social interactions, stuff like that. And it was always kind of based on the males. There are also a lot of racial and ethnic disparities in the diagnosis. A lot of Black and Hispanic children are way less likely to be documented with autism. And so I kind of took that into consideration while doing this project. A lot of studies and reviews about autism now are really recognizing that. So some of these early or sooner studies that I read, reviews and papers, really recognize that and kind of try to use all races and genders. And they say it in the beginning of their papers or their studies that all races and genders were considered when doing this study. So some older papers that I read didn't really take that into consideration, which was an issue, I guess, but especially the one that I used for autism, that one really recognized it because it was newer. So it's better, but that was something that I tried to keep in consideration while doing my project. So thank you. That is it.
Okay, exciting project too. Does anybody have any questions, comments? So now, what process did you use to come up and refine your equations?
So I can't totally hear you. Did you say what?
Walk over here closer. Like, what technique did you use for coming up with and refining your equations?
Yeah, so we did a lot of this was just a lot of research and kind of trial and error on Berkeley Madonna. One thing that we had to really think about was like kind of how to set it up, thinking about if there's that maximum amount of calcium to come in. So whether or not we use that Hill equation, which we kind of used different ones and tried to see how it worked out. But Hill equations worked the best for that. And it kind of made sense with the research we did as well. But yeah, it was a lot of just trial and error on Berkeley Madonna, kind of writing those differential equations and then seeing how it worked with some of those, because a lot of different papers gave us different concentrations for or variables for like the maximum amount of calcium or how the rate constant of how fast it moves through the mitochondria, something like that. So kind of figuring that all out. We did use Berkeley Madonna a lot for that.
So then how did, as you refined these equations, how did you validate their efficacy, I guess?
Yeah, so that was one of the things we talked about a lot with my advisor, that that's like why there's a lot of assumptions that were made in this. So a lot of the different variables we used were like more assumption based because of the lack of research. So mostly we validated it based on my professor. My advisor was like, this looks really good. That's kind of one of my big things that was a thumbs up. But it was mostly in Madonna, that trial and error again, we kind of, some of them just did not work and didn't look right for the calcium based on everything we read.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so what are you thinking you're going to do for your video? I bet that's the other guys that said they didn't.
Yeah, so I think that in order to make it quicker, I guess I'll probably go on through maybe some less of the intro stuff, or I think that making the cell model a little simpler to understand and just kind of explain might be good, to like kind of draw one out myself, which I kind of did here, but I think I can do a nicer drawing there, and then kind of do Berkeley Madonna.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it would be nice if somebody could, instead of trying to cover, a lot, try to maybe cover something specific and do a nice, draw to that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's one approach. I mean, I'm not saying that's the only approach.
Oh no, it's fine. I think I can do a lot better than, I've drawn one out that's good, but I'm not good at computer skills. So with that, my skills.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For the final video. All right, so this my list. Angie is doing her AI and legal stuff, and she brings a lot of excitement to this project. And so, are you there?
I am, yeah. Hold on, let me share the right screen real fast. Awesome. Can I see this? Oh wait, wrong one. All right, awesome.
Okay, good.
So my project is on ethics and machine learning using explainable AI. First, I'm going to go over a quick project overview. So just a quick refresher, my project surrounds explainable artificial intelligence and ethical questions surrounding that field through the lens of a case study. The field of explainable AI came as a response to a number of issues surrounding high machine learning, such as potentially fatal errors in high-risk fields, a lack of trust from desired users, and bias in algorithms favoring one group over another. It's new and rapidly evolving field pioneered by open source toolkits such as IBM's XAI360 and Google's What If toolkit. So my project objectives, the goal of my project was to develop an explainable AI that is accurate, clear, and interactive to end users, therefore maximizing trust, as well as identifying and mitigating biases. And not just for computer programmers, but a diverse range of shareholders, so one doesn't need to be an expert to understand the results of an algorithm. Trust is a driving force behind the push to develop XAI. There is no point in developing algorithms if no one trusts them enough to use them. Asking why an algorithm predicts a certain result and further understanding the reasons is imperative to building trust. Predominantly, we can rely on counterfactuals to form understanding, such as how one result differs from others, and what standout features create those differences, and which are relevant to the question at hand. It's simply if event X hadn't occurred, event Y wouldn't have occurred, showing a relationship between the two and understanding of event Y, such as if I hadn't walked into the coffee table, my leg wouldn't hurt. Additionally, the information needs to be novel rather than something you already known to end users based on a high level of expertise. For example, doctors who have been practicing for many years are able to identify cases quickly and know who will die in the emergency room, but relatively at the same speed as an algorithm, therefore require a quicker and more accurate algorithm for predicting those same results. Or else it's effectively useless, so there's no point in switching. The baseline for these algorithms isn't necessarily speed or accuracy, but it's being directly compared to human expertise. And as always, my project has evolved along with a different primary case study. So in tandem to my legal document processing, I've been also compiling and cleaning a data set of child deaths in America by county. It became clear that I was unable to finalize my natural language processing legal document algorithm in time for this presentation, so I fell back onto what I thought would be the best illustration of my philosophy and methods at the moment, The data set has been adapted from the ProPublica dataset, Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act reports from 2011-2015, covering all deaths of children in America from 2010 to 2015, includes the year of death, county of death, gender of the child, whether or not the previous investigations have been made into the home, and the original documents on each of the child's deaths, which include autopsies, police reports, investigative reports, all prior investigative reports. For all the missing data, I went through all the documents, reading manually each case and entered all the missing fields. Yes, that was as sad as you would expect. In addition to that, I ended up cleaning all the data from roughly all the causes of death from roughly 3,200 to 60, as well as labeled each as preventable or accidental. Preventable would be something like abuse or neglect. In addition to this data, I also supplemented it with over 200 demographic and geographic features for each county, things like education levels of residents, poverty, population, unemployment, and the scale from rural to urban from US Census data. Because of the way the data was formatted for the children, as well as not having a pool of living children to compare against, I was slightly limited in my prediction goals. By a child-per-child basis, my project mainly deals on predicting whether or not a death is preventable. As my data set evolves and grows, this will be more and more of a manageable prediction question. I have framework to tackle this. I think it's the final goal for this project, for any project surrounding social services, is being able to predict whether or not a child is at risk of dying in a preventable way from the first signs. It's heartbreaking to read nine plus reports of children before their inevitable end. 9+ reports like investigative, like someone tipped off somebody, like a teacher or someone, and they checked up on the child and they just said they were fine. So a significantly more manageable task for this time period than my original case study, as well as a unique data set with a lot of potential growth and further development. So the data set is simultaneously the most important and most interchangeable part of my project. The goal of this project is first and foremost to develop a machine learning algorithm for a high-risk situation and then apply XAI to ensure fairness in decisions. Therefore, getting at the heart of ethics within AI. Where do you draw the line when lives are on the line? At what point do we as developers are culpable for lives lost? What are our values and how do we ensure they are reflected in our code? So yes, this data set is very heartbreaking, unique, and interesting to me, but the real questions being examined here are philosophical ones. How do we ensure our algorithms reflect our values, and when push comes to shove, which of our values take precedence? Whether it's hiring, as I was first interested in, or sentencing or child abuse, these are all questions we as developers need to ask ourselves as we design systems to engage with these fields that make life-altering decisions. A child fatality data set allows for these questions of morals. Are false positives better than false negatives? Would we rather mistakenly tear a child away from a loving family to be subjected to a foster system, or would rather a child die from the ongoing abuses they suffer in silence? Since operating on a mainly county-based data system within my data set, will we be discriminating by proxy against different racial groups? AI is moving in the direction of weighing life. So who is most important to save right now? Do they need saving, or is the model wrong? Trusting the model sets forth a series of dominoes spawning from each child it flags. So my initial success criteria was a polished GitHub repository, which is in the final stages of assembly right now. The main aspect still being the philosophical writing accompanying the code. Because my presentation is due right now, I've been putting all my time and effort into my data set, my algorithm, and spending the remaining 10 days of class cleaning up the notebooks and bringing together my study on XAI theory and philosophy. Accessible and well-described efficient code. It's definitely well explained, tons of commentary to a ridiculous extent, explaining why we need each aspect philosophically, ethically, and software development wise, and also explaining what each thing does. And then my other goal was to have multiple data set demos, which, as I previously mentioned, although I did work with 3 different data sets, I am only attaching one to the project, though as I intend to keep working on this project, hopefully more will follow. Philosophical essay, as I previously mentioned, I have an ever-growing document of notes and thoughts, and it is waiting for me to be shaped into a coherent essay. Resources being used are books like The Alignment Problem, which is a super interesting book about bias in current algorithms, as well as how we code human values into AI, in case anyone's interested, totally recommend. Other readings like a social science paper from ASCII, and then Tim Miller's insight from the social sciences directly related to explainable AI. Lots of visualization was another goal, which was achieved, which is pretty much going to be the rest of the presentation. I'm still working on the interactive part. That will be ready by my demonstration, by the videos we're doing. So that will be the primary part of the videos I'm doing, showing off the what if tool, as well as mitigating risk in a interactive way to kind of show the process of that, because I think that's what's most important and most interesting about my project. And then real life applications, which is like the goal, because you want to make something relevant. So I achieved that too. I think the data set I chose was definitely applicable. I've applied for even better data with many more child-specific features from the National Data Archive on child abuse and neglect. I applied a couple weeks ago when I realized that I had to like move kind of farther away from the natural language processing because it just wasn't working out the way I was hoping. And hopefully I'll be approved for that over the summer to improve the algorithm even more. The real battle with this prediction model is the data. The majority of it isn't digital, but rather scanned documents. And those can be incidents. Some of the reports I read were just tables, others were sheets and like pages of documents for each child. The lack of standardization is definitely an obstacle for future work in this field. The data simply isn't arranged in a way where a single person or even a small team can easily sift through it and make a usable data set in an efficient way. Like the digitization of medical records, there needs to be some sort of revolution backed by incentives and penalties towards digital files and child welfare. A constant complaint is an understaffed nature of social workers, and a big help to the system would be a system to effectively flag children who are most in need of help to ensure their safety. Reading the files, it's heartbreaking to see children whose families have been investigated only to be cleared with the child dying weeks later. There needs to be an explainable system in the field which not only flags children at risk, but explains why, so they can be removed from dangerous situations and their parents can get help to prevent such tragedies. The why is an essential question here. There needs to be indicators of why a child is at risk for dying and preventable death after a site visit or initial investigation. There doesn't need to be 6 or 7 visits where the child is deemed safe only to still die. Abuse and neglect should be stopped after the first signs. And while my work here is far from a final word in the field, it needs to be explored more with better, more expansive data, because I believe this system is something that could, social. All right, so my project architecture consisted to begin with the data, which is explored and cleaned for a very long time, and also check for biases, which is extremely important. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so it was a lot of conjoining, a lot of supplementation and checking counties, but got there. So now onto the outcomes. So for the results of the initial algorithms, the accurate compare over fit has really big negatives to false positives and false negatives. But for examining with explainable AI and ethics and machine learning, these algorithms work perfectly for my problem. So some global explanations by logistic regression. So this is a white box explainable model. So think coefficients and the idea. So basically it is how a change in each feature might result in a change in log odds of a child at risk in the county of dying of preventable death. It additionally sheds light on which features are most important in the data set, something which is imperative here as we have well over 200 features. And then the best predictors here are surprisingly and higher representation score. And then moving on to tree-based models, which is more of a black box method, this is showing feature importance scores. So tree-based models inherently let us infer the importance of a feature because we can compute the decrease in impurity for each feature. So basically how clear each feature makes our prediction. This is called the Gini importance score. This is a visualization of those values. It appears the greatest predictor is age and gender, then services provided to fatality, and then educated adults in the county, with to name a few of the salient features. These all make sense considering these factors. These are all factors that lead to abuse of children on average. And then this is some doing with Lyme, doing instance explanations. So LIME locally explains black box models by adding noise to features for a given data point, therefore are getting to the core of what decisions surrounding this point are. Interestingly, these algorithms don't show many crossovers, but there are clear signs of potential bias, such as gender becoming a top feature for the random forest model. This data comes from a randomly selected data point in our test data. So, and then trusting LIME, because it's very important to trust the results is telling you how much each feature matters. So the lines here should be close. If not, we really can't trust LIME without the explanation. So clearly, they should be just completely disregarded, as long as we're taking caution with decision tree and random forest. Logistic regression and gradient boosting and MLP are more trustworthy LIME explanations. For the previous slide, so that would be P3. And then onto SHAP values. So each feature, basically SHAP values are each feature's contribution. It's different than LIME, but to the specific data point and to the overall prediction algorithm. So there's a lot of really cool uses for SHAP values. This comes from the IBM XAI 360s library. So basically repeatedly add each feature and then note its contribution for all possible ordering, like n factorial, and then it assigns credit to each feature. So clearly the most important feature here suggests a preventable death is previous services. I think you can see that in the first one. That's for the overall. So for previous services, it's if the services have been provided in the past, like they've checked in on the family and like that kind of stuff, it's a pretty big predictor that the death is not going to be an accidental death. Obviously, and then there's also age and gender. Which I'm going to talk about a little bit later about gender, but mostly younger kids are dying. So a lot of that is, if generally after the age of like 10, it's usually more of an accident because a lot of it's younger children that are passing away, unfortunately. Let's see if we can go here to explain there. Okay, so this is SHAP for the random forest. And since LIME provided not exactly reliable for that algorithm, we see similar results as the kernel explainer. Services provided is another big one. Same with year and age, which year is just corresponding to which year they're dying in. So that's not really the most important value, obviously, because these values are from 2011, 2015. But definitely age and gender, again, are relevant features and are more relevant to predicting which kids are at risk of dying of preventable death. So even though a lot of the features I have currently aren't child-specific features, I think that like if there was a data set that was better, or if I spend the time to actually go through like manually and go through like the 6,000 different children and really add to the data set, because a lot of them have a lot of more stuff than they actually put in the data set, because it's only like 6 or 7 columns for each child. I think it would be really, really interesting. And I think this would be an incredible thing. I just don't have the time or the manpower. I've applied for different data, and I think using this exact like algorithm and all this stuff would have a much more interesting feature. But seeing relevant features here is extremely important, because definitely if you're trying to make a case for why a child should be taken out of an environment, being able to see this is exactly why, like look at this kid in this, like it's a difficult area, like there's these signs, like this is what we saw in the report. It's really important because there's something else to point to, and there's a suggestion of a pattern. So get an idea to why the children are being flagged. And then also just the policy in general. So as I've kind of previously mentioned, the most important thing here is a push for standardizing and visualizing data, because not only data of fatalities, but investigative reports of children who are still living. Because while I entirely understand the risk of privacy of minors and their families who may be justly or unjustly accused of neglect or abuse, I personally think the safety of children outweighs that fear. But I don't think that matters to anybody. But like I really think the answer is homomorphic encryption. For those of you guys who don't know, homomorphic encryption is a process of data where data undergoes resulting encoded features and corresponding values. If privacy is kept, while trends can be found and predictions can be made, the privacy is kept. Essentially, those working on the data aren't really sure exactly what they're finding, but they are able to capture the meaning of the data numerically before the data is being sent back to the original shareholder and decoded to see the trends with their coherent feature values and predictions. People can find an answer to a question without knowing what the answer is or even what the question is. Doing digitization of reports opens up avenues for people and having it like encryption for people to improve social services data without compromising the privacy of children and parents. Because honestly, what this data set is missing is kids who lived, because I think the perfect model should include helping all children undergoing wrongful treatment, whether or not it is fatal. All the fatalities are more so public record. Most of the links to the scanned document include the victim and the perpetrator's names, date of birth, date of death. Simple Google search can lead to news articles and obituaries and other unbelievably sad websites. And as much as I really care about this project, obviously this is inadequate to really take on this issue. But I think it's really the data that's kind of missing here, because it just it needs to be something that people are more aware of. All right, so on to reflection. Awesome. So about software design, I am now way more familiar with available tools, as well as thoroughly educated in data cleaning, and in a lot of different kinds of data cleaning. So that's good. Definitely being organized is a huge thing. I started off initially cleaning data, and it was extremely chaotic and all over the place, and ultimately had to take a step back and completely revamp everything I was going about it. Luckily, that was before I was actually coding, so I took that mindset into programming. Comments, super vital, cannot emphasize enough, especially when it is coming to unknown technology like Shapley values or Google What If or IBM 360. And then learning about planning. So unfortunately, I am really optimistic and ambitious. So I think the main question I got for both my presentations were, are you actually going to do this project in this time that you just described? And the answer was no. I dream too big. I want to do 100 things. I still want to do 100 things. I'm happy with the steps I've taken towards these goals, and I'm happy with the place I am currently, but this is because it's the first stop towards the goals I've had at the beginning of the semester and still have now. This is certainly from an organizational standpoint, those aspects of my personality really worked against me. I needed to have realized my limits very early on, and I needed to curtail my project to make it way more manageable and more focused directly. I was really lucky to have decided to work on the child project all along. I've been working on it since the end of February, just because I thought it was it almost struck me when I was kind of looking at data sets. And I wanted to do something with it. So I just kind of cleaning it up kind of haphazardly at the beginning, just while I was doing something to have something on the back burner. For a good portion of this project, despite working with other data sets initially, but it really proved useful to me in the end. And I really just wish I decided to do it early on, because I'm really excited about the prospects that come with a more complete data set from the National Data Archive on Child Abuse and Neglect, as well as I would have actually maybe had the possibility to do the painstaking task of going through each document and creating more rows. But overall, it was a really good experience. And also another issue was I really loved the research phase of my project, because it kind of aligned perfectly with the kind of work I'm really used to doing here within my major. So I kind of fell really deep into that and prevented getting a physical head start on code. So I recently counted, I read well over 60 papers, as well as 3 different books on XAI and bias and algorithms. So I think I could have switched on and off coding and research weeks, and that could have been a better schedule rather than just at the beginning with the research while weaning myself off it, beginning coding. Some mistakes. So as I previously mentioned, I'm a big perpetrator of evolving projects. I would start out with one idea and then changes into many, many times. And as I can learn new information or find out new inspiration, I think it's a generally good quality, but it kind of led me on a more chaotic project trajectory than I intended. Luckily, my project never really was specific about the theory and everything else behind explainable AI and how it relates philosophically and legally in the world. So I felt I kind of had a little bit of flexibility. I know I kind of changed a bunch of times, but I think the main point was understanding explainable AI and values and how to code those. So I'm kind of happy with what everything happened, but definitely more chaotic. My penchant for change, coupled with my inability to winnow down, led me to where I am. I think my project could have benefited from me having a more concrete, unwavering plan from a psychological and organizational standpoint, but I'm happy with the path it took. It enabled me to know not only one sort of high-risk problem, but I explored many, many different avenues. In addition to social services, HR, and criminal law, as the 3 guys I've heard about, I also looked into the use of AI and XAI on a number of fields, including security, like lie detector and terrorism detector, Wi-Fi waves used to monitor imperceptible body signs, telling people one's psyche, autonomous weapons, facial recognition, natural language processing, and cancer diagnoses. So my study field is really well-rounded, with a really good overall knowledge of what decisions each field kind of faces and a good way of examining problems within them. Definitely, if I decided 100% on this data set earlier, there's a chance I would have a better data set and perhaps a more accurate algorithm. But the focus of the project though the case study is from social services, is about ethics and AI. So from that point of view, I spent my time correctly. So from a strictly software development side, I probably could have been more zeroed in on specifics. So racial and gender equity. So gender, the Shapley values show gender as a factor in the algorithm, but the data set itself is about 60% more boys, and the preventable data set actually is almost exactly 60% more of the preventable deaths being male. And then there's only a 2% difference in the reports filed. So from a data standpoint, there is relatively little bias in the system. Now going forward, looking a little closer at specific deaths and the cause of death, this is definitely a room for bias to slip in. And especially if we have more, if we include like natural language processing of documents and child-specific features, because going in that direction, that will be definitely a front and foremost project. Gender at the moment has a small push toward the preventable death and predicting a higher risk for males and females given the data set. This is unsurprising just because of the number. The implementation into that and their bias mitigation will be the final thing I do in the next 2 weeks. So I've already done my explanatory data analysis with the tools and use Shapley to identify values. If there is a difference in the piece of my if a puzzle is rectifying this, it will be covered in my video. And then race, as many of you guys know, you may have noticed there's no racial feature just due to the lack of data, and they just didn't have that in the data set at all. And it was really incomplete even on the data, like the things. And I could like, you can like look up like obituaries, but it's really, really time consuming. So I did that for a lot of people, but I ended up getting cause of death or like age off of that or gender. So not really the easiest thing to do it that way because it's really, really time consuming. So obviously proxy by discrimination by proxy is a very real thing because we have a lot of demographic data in the country and by county, but systemic problems such as underreporting overall are an issue, and that needs to be worked on in this field going forward, as well as standardization and digitization of investigations. So we can examine that feature to see if there is a underrepresentation of children from different races. And then the only this is sad, but like the only good thing about this data is being a data set of death is all the results are final. Some amount of heuristics can kind of be a good thing because I personally lean towards over prediction because just like, reading after so many case files, it's kind of better to intervene and do nothing. I feel like in this scenario, but I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see if so far, I think I've done a pretty good job of mitigating bias and making sure the data set itself is unbiased as much as I can. And I'm currently working with Google's What If tool and IBM, but it just wasn't ready for this project to show you guys today. So it'll be in the video. But yeah, so that is my presentation.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Anybody? So I guess one comment I think you made very early on, you were talking about, people, basically the danger of using AI when we don't really understand why it comes to its conclusions. And and one of the statements I think you kind of said was that people don't want to use AI if they don't understand how it works. Is that right?
I mean, not for high risk fields. I mean, I think it's kind of dangerous. Right. I don't think like most doctors would trust it if they don't understand why it's giving those values back. Because like this person needs this treatment. It's kind of one of those things. I think it's going to be really important, especially as more high risk fields incorporate artificial intelligence into their like day-to-day life. Right. So I think that I agree with you that in high risk fields, people are cautious. There's actually been a fair amount written about, and I think on the other end of the spectrum, oftentimes in culture, people come to just, again, for lower risk things, people come to just trust technology. And they just believe what is given to them. And they say, well, it must be right. The machine told me, right? And I think that's also very dangerous because it sort of creates in our culture this sort of normalization to believing what people arbitrarily have built. And it shapes, what we believe about the world and the decisions we make about the world. And I guess just one example that
just as a real obvious one is, right, when we use a search engine to search for things, we trust that that search engine is giving us, you know, reasonable answers or the best answers or something close to the best answers. But if we don't know the algorithms that are being used, and we don't know if there's behind the scenes preferences, right? You know, of course, in this class we talked about race and gender issues. We don't know whether there's biases being introduced on those lines or on many other lines, right? We don't know.
Yeah, no.
Right, and so I think that's an interesting aspect of all of this. It just comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I'm in a woman and gender studies class right now, and I did a Google search. Like there's a project at the beginning of like advertising, and they had you search like a product and like have like other people of different genders and different ages search. And I did protein powder as mine, and I got completely different results than most of my male friends. And usually worse results, which is really annoying. But it's like to notice. Like I wouldn't even really notice. I was like, oh, this is what.
Code versus essentially configuring existing systems.
Wait, I couldn't hear you. Could you?
Okay, yeah. Well,
sorry about that.
How much were you writing code versus configuring existing systems?
I would say a lot of the coding I did related to my data set of like searching for that sort of stuff. Predominantly, I would say for algorithms and stuff, that was kind of bits and pieces from different places that I've credited everybody I took like code from and stuff. And a lot of it's just kind of, certainly, I mean, like for using the IBM and the Google What If tool, that's all like me implementing it, but it's also like, you know, you're following, like you look at like the demos and then you kind of get a feel for it and all that kind of stuff. So I would say a ton went into the data cleaning and that entire process. That was a whole ordeal. I would say less so of me personally, but a lot of it was just fitting other people's code together in like different pieces and making sure everything worked together. So it was more like a weird jigsaw puzzle that was really frustrating a lot of the time. But I mean, a lot of it also had to be me like putting my own personal spin on it, because I obviously had a very different data set than a lot of what I was doing. And not a lot of them were optimized for kind of the amount that I was trying to put through that I was finding. But no, definitely I was not the primary. I wouldn't say I was like authored most of the code I have for the algorithms.
Right, and I didn't expect you would be. I was just curious.
Yeah.
So now, how did you pick this, you know, the children and death data?
I was on ProPublica like really early in the semester looking for a data set, because like obviously they had Compass, which is like a big thing, like XAI and like all that kept coming up. And I was kind of looking through like the data sets they had there, and I read this one and I was like, well, that sounds like the saddest thing I've ever seen in my life. But I put it on a list of data sets that I might be interested in. There was a bunch of other ones that I thought were like kind of like topical or like interesting. But I like downloaded this one finally end of February, because I was like trying to get a move on. And I was like kind of working with HR data, but it was like kind of difficult. And I was like, okay, like I was working a lot too. So I would come back and I was like, okay, like I'd come back from work, which is like really exhausting. And I would just like try and like clean the data, because I didn't want to not do anything after work, but I didn't really want to do like a lot of like hard stuff. So it was a lot of just like going through documents, and it was just like, I got so attached. Like it was like sad, because it was really bad too, because I'd like read the thing and then I wouldn't be able to like take the kid out of the data set, because as soon as I'd read the whole thing and like I was on obituaries, it was just like really like as soon as like I started actually going through the data set, I was like, well, this is like, I have to do something with this. Like now there's like this data set of all these children. Like this is so sad. I don't want to like kick anybody out. I don't want. It was just like, I don't know. I got kind of attached. So and then when the natural language processing one was really like the features weren't really working for me, and it was going to be just not feasible. And I was like, well, I have this data set I've been developing. It's a lot less like variables. It's a lot less like children. It's a lot less like entry data points, but I thought it'd be really interesting. And then I'd also been looking at the other data set from that thing. And it's like, that was a really expansive, good data set, but you had to apply with like this very long process. So I kind of didn't want to like pull the plug on that or pull the trigger on that until like I really like knew exactly what I wanted to do, because You had to like go through the whole thing. So I just kind of, I don't know, I got kind of attached, and then I just kind of like did it until it became apparent that I needed to change up. And I was like, well, at least I have this one, which is like, I feel passionate about. So I don't know, I'm happy with it.
Okay. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I will see you next Monday. We'll try to start quickly and get going, because that's going to be 5 next Monday. So we'll have plenty to listen to. So I will see you guys, and take care. And thank you for listening today and for presenting.